All right, so if you've been watching the channel, you know that our recent topic's been the Battle of the Bulge. We started in Luxembourg and visited both the American and the German cemeteries there. And we talked about the stories of some of the individuals who are buried in those cemeteries. Then we took those same stories and went to Bastogne and the surrounding areas and talked about the perspective of the battle where they fought and fell in. So it was originally not my intention to make this video today. I was going to include the footage as B-shots or as side notes in the other videos. However, as I was driving through and filming them, I realized that these are all important stories that deserve its own recognition. So we're going to be visiting towns, not just Foy, but also Noville, Neffe, as well as Ettelbruck and General Patton's memorial. So stick around to the end so we can both learn something together. So a lot of people know about the fighting that the 101st Airborne did here in the Bastogne area, but there was fighting going around in all of the towns in the surrounding area. Like for example, here at Neffe, on the 18th of December, right in this area, between the lines, Colonel Cherry's division tried to hold off the advancing German troops, and they did for a while and bought precious time. They held the German commander Byerlinen's divisions off. Time was bought here. So there's a story on all these little towns surrounding Bastogne. Like when the initial German advance pushed in here, a lot of the units that were here bought time to help set up the defense at Bastogne and to fortify the positions. So right now I'm down here in the village of Foy, and just behind me at those tree lines is where Easy Company had their positions. And right here is where the German lines were. Now the Germans would have been watching the Americans like a hawk, getting ready for that American attack that you see depicted in Band of Brothers, where they take the town. And vice versa, the Germans would be spotting artillery calls on the Americans from this position here. As you can see behind me, it's quite a ways of a distance, but Easy Company overlooking the town of Foy right here, and the Germans looking at the Americans just up the hill. So here we come to the village of Foy, where the German sniper opened fire and killed Kenneth Webb. You might think he was in the church tower, but no, he actually wasn't. He was right here in this building on the top floor. And if you take a look, you can still see bullet holes riddled against the building. And I believe the German sniper was eventually taken out by shifty powers. So yeah, here is the village of Foy. Also during the Battle of Foy, we lost the life of Patrick Neal, one of the members that we talked about at the American cemetery. So here's an interesting story. When the 101st retook the town of Foy, two soldiers went into the church in the ruins here and took a altar bell and a little Bible and brought it back with them to the United States. Well, both items were returned by the soldiers. On the 16th of December 1984, the bell was returned to the chapel here in Foy, and on the 22nd of September 2024, one of the children of the soldiers returned the Bible. And there's a plaque here in Foy saying thank you for returning the items, which is pretty cool. It just shows that these places here have immense history, immense little stories that you normally don't hear about unless you go to these places and read the memorials or talk to locals and hear the stories. So Kenneth Webb and Patrick Neal both fell in the proximity around Foy or in it. And here's a memorial depicting and thanking them for their service and the sacrifices that men like that made for the people of this village. So right behind me is the location of a former temporary American cemetery that held the remains of over 2,000 Americans who fell during the Battle of the Bulge. The temporary American cemetery here was replaced in 1948 and moved to larger cemeteries in Belgium or in Luxembourg. So as you come up to the plaque, you can see the American and the Belgian flag waving proudly above. And then you see two headstones, that of the same style that the headstones have in all the American cemeteries throughout Europe, the cross and the Star of David. And then we come up to the plaque here that says, "Here lies the site of the Foy American Temporary Cemetery from 1945 to 1948. It served as the temporary resting place for 2,701 Americans killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge." So right behind me is the plaque for the old temporary American War Cemetery here outside of Foy. And just behind it, down the hill, is the German War Cemetery outside of Foy. I think it's interesting. By late 1944, the war was already lost for Germany. The Allies were on the border of the Reich and the Red Army was pushing from the east. Hitler ordered one last-ditch attack, smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and take Antwerp. For the High Command, it was a gamble. For the men on the ground, it was a death sentence. The plan relied on speed and surprise, but it was stalled here in the snow and the mud of the Ardennes. American units held key crossroads like Bastogne, and the German advance turned into a slow, bloody struggle in the forests and the fields. So right now I'm in the village of Noville, just outside of Foy, and this village is important to the American story and the German story of the Battle of the Bulge. See, the 10th Armored Division here held the German advance long enough to stall them and buy that precious time. The Germans struck Noville hard, spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Division. The American defenders of the 10th Armored Division fought from the village and the tree lines, trying to delay the advance just long enough for the main defense to form at Bastogne. That delay was the crucial success. By holding this ground, they forced the Germans to spend fuel, daylight, and combat power. They could not afford to lose. But there's a grim civilian history here as well. After the Americans were forced to pull back, the occupying forces committed brutal reprisals against innocent civilians, and they were executed in this area. A reminder that the people who lived here often paid the highest price. And there's memorials every year and memories of those civilians who were killed. And then on the 14th and the 15th of January 1945, the 101st Airborne and a task force from the 705th Tank Destroyer, as well as the 11th Armored Division of General Patton, liberated this region and the town of Noville after heavy losses. So if you're exploring the history of Bastogne and the battle that was in the surrounding areas at the Bulge or at Foy, come here to Noville as well, because this village right here deserves the same recognition because it was equally as important as Foy or Bastogne. The fighting that happened here was massively critical to the overall battle. So behind me is a monument from the town of Berlé for the 90th U.S. Infantry Division, which liberated this town on the 9th of January, 1945. That just goes to show that how massive this entire battle was. It wasn't just around Bastogne, it was all over the Ardennes. So here in Luxembourg, you have the memorial for the 90th U.S. Infantry Division. So the 90th U.S. Infantry Division, what they were doing here in Berlé was part of the American counteroffensives that reduced the Bulge and what we know as the Battle of the Bulge. I really love coming to small towns like this that you've never heard of and trying to learn the stories of what happened here, because it's part of the bigger picture and it's important to remember these events as well, not just the big ones. So in the town of Berlé, Luxembourg, there's two memorials for the liberation, and this one right here is for the 90th Infantry Division. As you come up to it, you have a plaque right here. And over here you can see some pictures depicting the liberation and the battles around. And over here you have pictures from the town of Berlé in 1945. I stressed the point before, but the Battle of the Bulge and the Ardennes offensive was a massive undertaking. And there's so many stories behind each little town and each little village, not just Bastogne. And each sacrifice deserves to be remembered. I know that Banner Brothers and Easy Company is a great entry point into history for many people, but it also opens the door to explore many other stories and battles fought, for example, by the 90th Infantry Division. And the final stop ends up right here in Ettelbruck. Ettelbruck was one of those towns in Luxembourg that was originally liberated in September of 1944. However, when the Wehrmacht launched their surprise attack in December, they retook this town. Heavy fighting ensued around here, and the town was re-liberated on Christmas Day of 1944. However, the German threats still persisted until January. For an example, an American colonel was ambushed and killed after the liberation the second time of Ettelbruck. And right here behind me is the memorial to General Patton as a thank you to him for the liberation of this town. Just a small correction, I said Ettelbruck was liberated on Christmas Day of 44. It was actually December 27th, 1944, when the town was officially liberated for the second time. So that brings us to an end of today's video. But it's not just the end of the video, it's also the last video in my Luxembourg and Bastogne series. So if you haven't seen those videos, make sure you check out the playlist and view some of those topics. And if you enjoyed today's content, please consider subscribing. We have some interesting topics coming up soon. For example, I'm going to be in France and covering several different German war cemeteries and stories there, as well as the Netherlands later this year. So if you're looking forward to hearing those stories from my perspective and that we can learn something together, I'd greatly appreciate it if you stick around. And until the next time, I look forward to it.